So before starting the Shiur today, Baruch Hashem, yesterday I got the second dose of the vaccine. And to all those that care for me and concerned about me, Baruch Hashem, besides some pain in my left arm that was vaccinated, that I feel perfect and I'm well, I'm fine, Baruch Hashem. And it is another opportunity to thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu for his chesadim, for the amazing success in developing this vaccine. And to our terrible dismay, in Eretz Yisrael, we are amidst a huge wave of disease, and we're at the worst stage that we ever were in Eretz Yisrael. And in many places in the world, but in Eretz Yisrael in particular, we are in the midst of a huge surge, especially in the Haredi community. Thousands of new people falling ill every day, and to our terrible dismay, many people have died. Men and women, relatively young, in their 40s, and so many new Yesomim, and it's tragic. So I once again take this opportunity, as I did 1,000 times in the past year, to plea and to beg. Follow the rules. And right now, please vaccinate. Statistically, this is a safe vaccine. No obvious danger. And on the other hand, people are dying every day. So Baruch Hashem, I'm doing fine. I hope the vaccine will be effective. And my answer to everyone is, please go and at the very first opportunity that you can, get vaccinated. So in this week's Parsha, Parshas Vayera, we continue to learn about Golus Mitzrayim and Geulas Mitzrayim. And Chazal say that Golus Mitzrayim was in the merit, B'schus, Shaloshinu, Shlosh Dvorim, Shmam, Lishonam, V'levusham. So the concept we will be discussing today is Yehereg V'al Yavor, with special emphasis on the concept of Shas HaGzeiro. Sanhedrin Ayin Dalad Avodah Zarah Chav Zayin Yerushalmi, Shvias Daf Yud, and other sources in Shas, we have the details, the rules, the halachas of Yehereg V'al Yavor. Perek Hey Mehilchas Yesoida HaTorah. And the fundamentals are, we discussed many times, Bal Peu B'chsav, the fundamentals, Gimel Avedas Chamuros, Avodah Zorah, Shvichas Domim, Gili Arayis, always Yehereg V'al Yavor. All the other mitzvahs, Befarhesia, Yehereg V'al Yavor, Shas HaGzeiro, even Bitzino. But these halachas are relevant when the Goyim, when the non-Jews want to force us to tear us away from Torah and mitzvah. That is how we define Shas HaGzeiro. That is a Chilul Hashem. And that is when we are required to be Mekayim the mitzvah V'negdashti b'toich b'nei Yisrael. Hanoas Atzmon Shani. So in Chazal, there are three different examples. What is defined as a Noas Atzmon? First of all, the story of Esther and Achashverosh. Esther was brought to Achashverosh. She could do nothing about it. So why didn't she kill herself? Why wasn't the din Yehereg V'al Yavor? Hanoas Atzmon Shani. Achashverosh wasn't out to tear Esther away from her emunah, from her people, from her Yiddishkeit, from her mitzvahs. He was just crazed by his lust, and that is Hanoas Atzmon. The other examples that we find in Bavli, in Yerushalmi, in the sources that I quoted, where non-Jews forced Jews to be Machal Shabbos for their benefit. One story is, a non-Jewish minister asked a Jew, I want you to make a coffee for me or cook for me. He had no intention of being Mavir Oisoi Aladas, tearing him away and imposing on him to be Machal Shabbos, just for his own personal benefit. And in Shvias and the Yerushalmi, we deal with non-Jews, the authorities imposed on the Jews to work the fields in Shnas HaShvias and Shnas HaShmita, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to pay taxes, to pay what the government expected them to pay from their income. Those are the classical examples of Shas, of Hanoas Atzmon. So there's a machlokes between the poskim. The heter of Hanoas Atzmon is only by Fahesia or Shas Gzeira as well. And there are three different opinions about Hanoas Atzmon when the non-Jews are not out to fight Yiddishkeit, to fight our religion, to impose on us, to stray from our convictions and our mitzvahs. They're just for their personal benefit. The Balamor maintains even Gilui Arayis and Avodah Zorah is Yavor Va'al Yehereg if their intention is a Noas Atzman. But the Balamor is a Yochid. The Ramban rejects his opinion, and Malchames Perik Ben Soyer Amoirish in Sanhedrin Afayin Daled. And most of the poskim follow in the Ramban's footsteps. Gimel Averas Chamidas are always Yehereg Va'al Yavor. The Bach maintains Hanoas Atzman bears leniency only for Hesia, but B'Shas Gzeira, even Hanoas Atzman Yehereg Va'al Yavor. The Taz and the Shach both reject the Bach. Kuf Nun Zayin, Yoredea Taz Siv Kotten Gimel, Shach Siv Kotten Zayin. And their opinion is, Hanoas Atzman is not a Chilul Hashem. And therefore, besides Gimel Avedas Chamuris, which are always Yehereg Va'al Yavor, Farhesia Shelo B'Shas Gzeira, Shas Gzeira B'Tzina, if their intention is to tear us away from our Torah and mitzvahs, Yehereg Va'al Yavor. If their intention is for their personal or communal benefit, the din is Yavor Va'al Yehereg. And I want to address, B'Kitzur, two tragic periods in European Jewry which caused a major halachic discussion and controversy. Gzeres HaLavush on one hand and the Cantonistim on the other. And I think these two periods, besides being tragic periods, brought forth very interesting halachic discussions. It all happened almost 200 years ago. To be more precise, 195 years ago. I think it started in Tovkuf Pevov in Russia, and then in Poland. So let's start with the Gzeres HaLavush. The Tsar Nikolai II, I think, was a big anti-Semite. And the Maskilim prodded him along. And they suggested to him, we need to integrate and enlighten the Jews, take them out of the Dark Ages. And one of the ways to do that is to pose on them to change their garb. So the decree was that Jews need to cut their beards, cut their payas, and wear short garments, not the long black garments that were minhag Yisrael, customary in Jewish quarters, especially in Hasidic quarters. Hasidus was a fledgling movement at the time. And that was the Gzeira. And from Russia, it went on to Poland. And when the Gzeira come to Poland, the Chidush Harim stood at the forefront, and he argued, Yehereg Va'al Yavor, this is a Gzeiras Shemad. We can't let this happen. That was the psak of the Chidush Harim. Arke said the Mesana Yehereg Va'al Yavor. So it might not be a lav, but it's minhag Yisrael, and b'shas gzeira Yehereg Va'al Yavor. The Rambam doesn't bring the din of Arke said the Mesana. Interesting. And the Noise Kelim wonder why. Sanhedrin Ayin Daled Amud Beis, Rashi explains Arke said the Mesana is just a certain style of footwear, shoes. The Jews had different shoes than the Goyim. Shas gzeira Yehereg Va'al Yavor. Rashi writes it's a minhag. The Kesef Mishnah's interpretation of the Rambam, Perekem Yesida Torah, is that Rambam follows in the footsteps of the Rif. And they maintain it's a lav of Bechukuseim Lo Telechu. It's just not a different style of footwear. It was a deficiency in tznius. Maybe it was associated with Avodah Zorah. It is a lav of Bechukuseim Lo Telechu, not a minhag. So the question was, changing your dress, cutting your beard and payas. Obviously, we're not dealing with a lav. because they didn't impose on the Jews to cut their payas with a tar, just not to have big payas and a bushy beard. But the Chidushari maintained that is Shas Gzeira Arkas de Masana Yeherig Val Yavar, and he wasn't the only one. Before him, it was the opinion of the Vilna Gaon. So the Gaon passed away many years before this Gzeira. But the Chaya Odom in Chochmas Odom Yoredei Peita Sif Aleph writes, I remember there was a similar Gzeira in Vilna at the time, and the Gaon said Yeherig Val Yavar. Even though Tzorech and Godol, I'm just bringing this for people to understand how important Minhagei Yisrael are and how important it is not to change your levush. Shalei Shinuas Levusham. And in the merit of Shalei Shinuas Levusham, we were redeemed from Golas Mitzrayim. So the Vilna Gaon maintained Yerek Val Yavar. Chachma Sodom wonders, Tzorech and Godel, but he doesn't share with us why is it Tzorechim. Based in Mumche demands 3 dayanim. Vilna Gaon, Chidush Sharim. Third one is Reb Shloime Kluge. Sharas Yeshuvas Tuv Tam Vedas Yoredeya Madura Kama Kuf Peches Kuf Peites. He also maintains Yeherek Val Yavar. And at the time, the Hasidim in Poland, especially Gerach Hasidim, were Moise Nefesh. They didn't leave their homes. They fought, and many of them left Poland and moved away to neighboring countries to escape the Gzeira Salavush. On the other hand, many Gedolim paskined, it's not Yehereg Val Yavar. Tzemach Tzedek, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, he was in Russia. He was at the source of this terrible Gzeira. Tzemach Tzedek, Yoredei Tzadik Tzadik Aleph. Beis Shloim in Galicia, Yoredei Kuf Tzadik Zayin, Divrei Nachemi was a chosed of the Tzemach Tzedek, one of the Gedolim of the time, Yoredei Simon Pei Aleph, and notably Imrei Eish. Amen Ur Einikel, my great-great-great-great-grandfather was the Imrei Eish. He was the greatest of the Samsoifas Talmidim. Who am I to say that? Because I am a descendant of the Imrei Eish? Protectia? No. The one that testifies is the Ksav Sofer, the great son of the Chassam Sofer. And in Drosha Chassam Sofer, there's a hesped on the Imrei Eish. Reb Meir Ash, Ksav Sofer writes, he was Gdol Talmidei Avi Meiri. Imrei Eish Yerdei Semenun Hei. He says, no, it's not Yehereg Val Yavar. And the reasoning of these 4 Gedolim was threefold. Number 1 is a tremendous chiddush. I have difficulty accepting this chiddush. But some of these Gedolim argued, this Gzeira is not Gzeira Shmad, it is Lahanoas Atzmon. Their goal is not to tear us away from Yiddishkeit, but to assimilate us and to create a feeling of equality. Their interest was that the entire populace feels comfortable with one another to enhance trade, commerce, culture. They felt that the country will be healthier if all are the same. They did not appreciate diversity. They wanted everyone to be uniform. So the Tzemach Tzedek and some of the other Gedolim I quoted said, that is B'chlal Hanoas Atzmon. I would argue, we don't care what their ultimate goal is, but their immediate goal is to tear us away from our way of life, to tear us away from mitzvahs, from minhagim, and therefore that would be defined as Shas HaGzeira. But the other Gedolim that were lenient argued, they let you put on tefillin, they let you do a bris, they let you keep Shabbos, they just want you to look and appear like all the others. That is Hanoas Atzmon, and it's not defined as a Gzeira Shmad. The other point was, what's the point in fighting? What's the point in dying if the fact was, and historians write that this happened on a daily basis. When a Jew left his house and the police caught him, they just took out a pair of scissors and cut off his beard, cut off his bias. They slashed his beged, his garments, and cut them short. So It's not within our power to fight this, They could just do whatever they do with us. We are at their mercy. So why should people die if we won't achieve the goal anyway? Argument number 3 was that would not be defined as minhag hagoyim, because even in their time, almost 200 years ago, there were many Jews that already wore short garments, that did not have a big beard and big payas. So that would not be defined as gzeres shmad, because it is not uniquely and goyish. Generally, and this is a point that the Beis Shloimeh makes, as long as there is some heker in Jewish malbush, okay, so we won't wear long garments, we'll wear short garments. But it will be somewhat different than what the non-Jews wear, that takes us out of the category of the Chukasem Lo Telechu, and that therefore would not be Yehereg Val Yaver. 20 years approximately transpired, and the Gzeira came to Krakow in Poland in a different ploy. And like Pare said, Hovones Chakmoloi, they saw it's hard to fight these stubborn Jews. We're getting nowhere. So instead of forcing them to change their begodim, to change their dress, forcing them to cut their beards and payas, there was a different decree. Anybody that wants to get married before age 30 must wear short begodim and cut his beard and payas. Otherwise, you would not get a permit to marry before age 30. If you're 30 years old, go ahead. We have no conditions. But anybody that wants to marry before age 30 needs to change his dress and his appearance, the way he looks. And at this stage, we find shulis of Gedolei Galicia and Hungary dealing with this question. And there were 2 different parties. The Imre Eish, in that very same tshuva, says, no, we should not change our dress. And we will postpone the chasanas till age 30. So the approach of the Imre Eish is somewhat in middle of the road, not extreme, this way or the other. On one hand, he says, it's not Yehereg Val Yavar, I don't want people to die. On the other hand, it is extremely important not to change our dress, and therefore we won't get married till age 30. That is the opinion of the Imre Eish, Yoredei Simenun Hey. His contemporary was Reb Zev Frenkel, the Rav in Reisha, in Galicia. Shalosh Tshuvas Meishav Kalocha Simen Zayin Simen 2 tshuvas, agrees with the Imre Eish. On the other hand, one of the Hasidic Rebbeim happened to be a great Talmid Chacham, the Jikav Rebbe, Shalosh Tshuvas Imre Noyem Chelik Beisim in Tet Zayin. He was a Mechutna of the Divrei Chaim, and the Divrei Chaim writes in a letter that he's a big Ilui and a big Charef. Go'on Mechudad Ma'oid. And he says, Chas v'sholom. This is a terrible gzeira. Our youngsters shouldn't get married till 30. Bitul mitzvahs priorvio. Lo nivra ho'olam ela mishum priorvio. Lo toye baroa l'sheves yetzora. And how much aveira will this encourage? What do we expect of young people? How will they stay away from averis if they can't get married till 30? And he says, Chas v'sholom, we should change our garments inasmuch as it is imposed on us ben shemoin esrei lechuppah. So would I say that the fundamental difference was between the Hasidic attitude and worldview and the Misnagdische one? I don't think so. Just different opinions based on halachic analysis. I think Reb Zev Frenkel was a chassid, but I'm not sure. And he was in the same opinion as the Imre Eish, was a Talmud of the Chassidus and Ashkenazim. So this is an interesting discussion. So everything I quoted till this moment deals with Gezeres HaLevush. And now let me tell you the story, those that don't know about the Cantonists, and that was a far more dark period in the history of European Jewry. In Russia, in the same period, the Russia Nikolai II Tsar, Jews were drafted to the Russian army for a period of 25 years. It wasn't a personal draft, but rather each kehillah got a decree and a demand from the authorities relative to the size of the kehillah, to the size of the community. You need to supply 1,000 youngsters for military service. You need to supply 500 youngsters for military service. They were given a quota. Brings to our memory the darkest times of our history in the death camps when the Nazis demanded from the Judenrat and from the Elderster to supply a number of people to the gas chambers, to forced labor, as they lied. And it was the Jews that need to decide, mila chayim v'mila mavis. So the Russians, it wasn't about extermination, about annihilation, but it was about spiritual annihilation. Those boys were taken to 25 years to the Russian army, torn away from their heritage, from their Messiah, from their Torah, from their mitzvahs, totally assimilated. And the kehillas had to decide who goes and who stays at home. And this tore the kehillas apart. Always in times of tragedy, sometimes it brings out the worst in people. And there were macharim that used to snatch kids off the street, take them into custody, and give them over to the Russian authorities. So the wealthy people bribed them with money to stay away from their children. And the ones that paid the price were the poor and the desperate. Those children, Shaleim Omru Chazal, Hizharu Bivnei Aniyim Shemahem Teitzei Torah. They didn't have the means to bribe the officials, to bribe the thugs and the macharim. And they were the ones that were taken off the street, taken out of the schools, and given over to the authorities. And this kufa brought a whole range of halachic issues. Shalosh machloikes bedover. We find a painful tshuva in Chassam Sofer, Chelek Vav Siman Chav Tes. And at the beginning of his tshuva, the Chassam Sofer writes, Shtikosach yofa mediburech. I would prefer not saying anything, because what do I have to say? What do I have to say? The situation is so sad and so tragic. So the Chassam Sofer writes a few principles. If the government would demand you and you and you, Dina de Malchus Adina, what could we say? Dina de Malchus Adina. But that's not the situation. They just give us a quota, a number. And we are the ones to decide who goes, who stays at home. So the Chassam Sofer writes, Chas v'sholem, for us to decide in an arbitrary way. We can't just decide, snatch kids off the street and send them to military service. So many Gedolim and many Rabbanim and many Askonim argued, we need to take the ones that don't keep Torah mitzvahs anyway. They don't keep Shabbos anyway. They don't eat kosher anyway. So they might as well go to the Russian army and serve and salvage all the others that keep Shabbos and learn Torah. And the Chassam Sofer disagrees, and he says, a Jew is a Jew. What right do you have to impose on him, snatching him off without his consent and sending him to salvage others? We need to do a goyrel. Yatel goyrolis. And we need to decide al pi goyrel. It's not for us to decide. Ein doiche nefesh mipnei nefesh. And one of the great Gedolim, a contemporary of the Chassam Sofer, writes the same. Shalas Tshuvas Noide B'Yehuda Chelik Daled Yordei Siman Ayin Daled. It's not a tshuva of the Noide B'Yehuda. The Noide B'Yehuda passed away Tov Kuf Nun Ches 30 years before this era, before this tkufa. That tshuva is from his son, Reb Shmuel Lando, who fulfilled his position as the Rav of Prague. And he writes the same as the Chassam Sofer. We have no right to decide But that boy isn't keeping Shabbos anyway. But he might do tshuva tomorrow. It's not relevant. The Chassam Sofer writes a powerful line, and he writes, maybe it's better that the frum boys should go serve in the army, because they won't be mechal Shabbos unless it is totally necessary in a pekuach nefesh situation. They will try to eat kosher and not treif. But if you send the ones that are weak in their Yiddishkeit, that is a real ifnei evel sit in mechshoil. So that is the opinion of the Chassam Sofer and Reb Shmuel Lando. And the Chassam Sofer's tshuva is full of pain and distress. And he writes, I don't even think it's right to bribe children and give them money to volunteer instead of the frum ones. However, that is common practice. And we can't change that. It's done all the time. It is not within our power to prevent that. So, let it be. That's the approach of the Chassam Sofer. I'm not going to be moiche, and this is what is just happening. But chas v'sholom, not to take anyone without his agreement, without his consent. Me'ikar adin, the Chassam Sofer writes, I would prefer a goyrel. But the Chassam Sofer writes one fundamental principle. Don't touch b'nei Torah. Those that are learning Torah full time, stay away. And don't touch bavas einoi. Our kiyum is in the merit and the schus of a melee Torah. He doesn't quote the Tanchume, but it's a Medish Tanchume Parshas Noach. A melee Torah sheblapev v'yoyim v'laylo shebeschusam hu olam kayim. So opinion number one is Reb Shmuel Lando and the Chassam Sofer. On the other extreme end of the spectrum, Shalas HaTshuvas Chesed LaAvraham, Chelek Aleph Siman Mem Hey, I think it's Chesed LaAvraham. He was younger than the Chassam Sofer and Reb Shmuel Lando. He was an Einekel, a grandson of the Nesivos HaMishpat. And he is very choshev tshuvas. Siman Mem Hey, he argues, it is within the authority of Manhigei Akelos of the Gaboim. Yes, to impose, we will take those children that don't keep Torah mitzvahs, give them over to the authorities to save the others, to be able to continue with a life of Torah and mitzvahs. Why? How? His argument is based on the sugya of v'chi oimrim la'odam chatei kedei sheyiske chaveircho, an amazing approach. So many times he spoke about the stira, two sugyas in Shas. Shabbos Daf Daled, the Gemara wonders, v'chi oimrim la'odam chatei kedei sheyiske chaveircho? No, definitely not. And therefore, if one person is hidbik pas betanor, he was over on the Oraisa, we wouldn't say another should take the bread out of the oven, even though it's only a shvus. Tosfos, both in Shabbos Avdalet and the native and Lamed Beis, asks, there's a contradiction, a stira between two sugis, the native and the Lamed Beis. The Gemara says, if a chaver sent an amoritz peiris and he forgot to take off Trumas Amaisis, he should be mafresh shalom and a mukaf. It's an isser, but you got to save that other person from eating tevel, which is a harsh or aveira. So it seems to be a stira between the two sugyas. We find two terutzim in Tosfos. One is hidbik pas betanar posha. Posha, we do not expect another to be over even an isakal to salvage him from an aveda b'mezid. But that person got peiris from a Talmud Chochem. He would assume, and rightfully assume, that it's not tevel. And he will be nichshal b'shoigeg. And therefore, and that's the case, then nichalei lachoved eliyeved isura zuta. So the difference is between posha and loy posha. The other approach of Tosfos is, in the story in Erevin, I was the one that caused him to be nichshal. I was machshalim. He relies on me, that probably I was mafresh tumas amaisis, and therefore it is my responsibility to save him from aveir. Chesed LaAvraham argues halacha ketirutz kamo, and therefore we expect the non-from to be over isure zuta, kedei to salvage the other ones from isure rabo. So the argument of the Chesed of Rome is, if a person is a Machal Shabbos anyway, if he eats Nevedas Atrefes anyway, so it'll be more Machal Shabbos. He'll have more Nevedas Atrefes. That is considered the Isura Zuta, a small Aveda, compared to taking a boy and tearing him away from Yiddishkeit that is so precious to him and causing him to grow up totally detached and torn away from Mereshes Avos, from Torah, from mitzvah. I find this a very questionable approach, and I think that some Sofer is right, and Reb Shmuel Lando. It's not only about Isura Zuta and Isura Rabba. Even if that would be the argument, it still is questionable. Why is this Isura Zuta? After all, a person could do tshuva any moment in his life. And why is this Isura Zuta? Does it make a major difference port of departure? Or is it all dependent on the destination? So I am from and he is not. But the conditions in which we will both be in the Russian army are horrendous. And they will grow up with no Jewish identity, with no Jewish values, with no kesher at all to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to Torah and mitzvah. So Mahechet Tesed to define this as Zura Zuta and Zura Rabba. Argument number 2. The question is, do we recommend, or is it a chayv on a person to do one lesser Aveda to salvage another from a greater Aveda? But this is changing his entire life. It's not about one Aveda, one time. It's about changing his entire life. And it's not only about mitzvahs. It is taking a boy, tearing him away from his family, sending him to a life of the most desperate and dire conditions. He will need to fight Russian wars. He might get killed in battle. His life will be a life of suffering. Who will he marry? If he gets married at all, probably he'll marry a Russian girl. His children will be goyim. How do we define this as a surah zuta? And what does it have to do with those sugyas which deal with a one-time avera kala to save another person from an avera chamura? And therefore I find this tshuva and chesed Avrohom very far-fetched. And I think that Chassam Sofer was right. Approach number 3 is Imre Eish. Gzera Salavush, I quoted Siman Nun Hey, and now we go back to Siman Nun Beis. The Imre Eish is more lenient than the Chassam Sofer, and he writes, it's mutar lechatchila to pay other people, other youngsters, to volunteer to save our children or ourselves. The Chassam Sofer says, it is the reality. What could I say? I don't like it, but what could I say? The Imre Eish says it's even mutar lechatchila. But when we learn the tshuva, he is dealing with a totally different situation than the one described by the Chassam Sofer and by Reb Shmuel Lando. And it was a different period, different circumstances. The original Shiloh was the Cantonistim in Russia, 25 years of service with no Yiddishkeit at all. The Imre Eish deals with service in the Hungarian army 20 or 30 years later. And what he describes is they don't impose on anyone Chilul Shabbos. And if you wish, you could eat kosher food. The only thing you'll have to violate is chutz l'tchum, carrying weapons, tiltel muktzeh. And therefore, what's so tragic? He's not dealing with 25 years of service, but relatively short service, like in most countries of the world today, or in their days, a few years. And therefore, we cannot compare the tshuvas 1, 2, 3, Noy Debiu Chassam Sofer Chesed Lavron, to the tshuva that we find in Imre Eish. Different conditions, different circumstances, different gzeira. So today we discussed the fascinating sugya of Shas HaGzeira. I apologize that this shiur is so much shorter than it usually is, because I have many obligations and shiurim and divrei mitzvah today. But this week we read Parshas Va'era. And in the very beginning of Parshas Va'era, we start off with Daled L'shoines Shel Geula. והויצאתי אתכם מתחת סבלס מצרים, והצלתי אתכם מעבודתם, וגואלתי אתכם בזרועי נטויה בשבותם גדולים, ולקחתי אתכם לי לעם. והויסוי לכם לאלוקים, וידעתם כי אני השם אלוקיכם המוציא אתכם מתחת סבלס מצרים. והויצאתי והצלתי, וגואלתי ולקחתי. דלת לשונה של גאולה. And that is why we drink Dalet Koises Beleil HaSeder. Hagodah Shel Pesach Minchas Osher, and also Sichas Moyadim Chelek Gimel Minchas Osher. I wrote a thought. It's not Pshat, it's Drush. Between Kais number 1 and 2, between 2 and 3, we could make a hefsek, we could eat, we could drink. Between 3 and 4, no hefsek, no eating, no drinking. Why is that? What was the tachlis of Aseres HaMakkos, the 10 plagues? And in this week's parsha, we learn about part of the 10 plagues. L'man tesaper ba'ozni bincho uven vincho es asher salalti b'mitzrayim ves esoisai asher samti vam. 2 objectives, 2 goals. Es asher salalti b'mitzrayim. These Makkos were to punish Paroi and the Egyptians for their treachery, for their cruelty inflicted on Klal Yisrael. And the other objective is Ve'es oisoisai asher samti bam. Who is that bam? Pshuto shel mikra de Mitzrayim. Maybe us. Bincho uven vincho. And the Rishonim explain that the tachlis of Aseres HaMakkos was not only to punish them, but to be machazik, the amunah and betochen of Bnei Yisrael, after hundreds of years of slavery. And the Mitzrim, like the Russians and the Poles, tried to tear us away from Yiddishkeit, tried to destroy our people, physically and spiritually. Begashmias uberuchnias. After hundreds of years, they were so far away, and they needed chizuk. And that is why Kodesh Baruch Hu showed them oisis and miracles, just to bring them back home and to be machazik them in emunah and betochen. And Yetzias Mitzrayim had 2 different goals. One was to redeem them from slavery. Voitzesi esam atachas sivlas Mitzrayim. Vitzalti eschem ma'avodosam. But also v'lakachti eschem lilam v'yisi lachem le'elokim. To bring them back to the level of avoiseihem. And the Ramban writes, the entire Sefer Shemois is defined as Sefer HaGolos v'Hagula. It is only the first 3 parshas that deal with Golos and Geula, but the Ramban says no. Geula is only Ad Asher Al Malas Avoisem Yeshuvun. So Akomes HaMishkan is part of the Geula. Coming closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Hashoras HaShchun is part of the Geula. And that is the objective of Yetzias Mitzrayim and Aseres HaMakkos. Some of us would be happy with the first 3 cases, and they would forego number 4. Some of our brethren would be happy and appreciative of Voitzesi, Veitzalti, Vegoalti. They feel less attached, and they do not associate with number 4, V'lakachti eschem li la'am v'yisi lachem la'elokim. But we mean to emphasize and demonstrate the first 3 are only to achieve number 4. And number 4 is the climax and the culmination of our efforts. Number 4 is the real tachlis. V'hoitzeisi v'itzalti v'goalti is ultimately all about v'lokachti eschem li la'am v'hoyisi lochem le'elokim v'yadatem ki ani Hashem Elokeichem hamotzi eschem etachas tzivlos Mitzrayim. And that is why you could make a hefsek between 1 and 2 and 2 and 3, but not between the first 3 and number 4. To prove to emphasize. Ultimately, it is all about number 4. ולוקחתי אתכם לי לעם, והויסי לכם לאלוקים וידעתם. כי אני השם אלוקיכם המוציא אתכם מתחת סבלוס מצרים. And that is why we have so many mitzvahs. Only to remember Yetzias Mitzrayim. Yesod hu emunah, Yesod ha-betochen. All the Shalosh Regalim and Shabbos Kodesh as well. Zecher li-Yetzias Mitzrayim. Because it is at Yetzias Mitzrayim that we became HaKadosh Baruch Hu's people. That we all lifted our eyes to the heaven and said, Ze keli va'anveyu. Ki emeitzeischa miyeretz Mitzrayim arenu neflois. We should be zecher b'kora b'yameinu. HaKadosh Baruch Hu yerachem oleinu. HaKadosh Baruch Hu should send us Moshiach tzidkenu. B'mheiro v'yomeinu. Amen.